Welcome everyone to this town hall. My name is Reverend Dr. Katie Gibbons-KIME, and I'm the Director of Religion and Civic Engagement at Odyssey Impact. Just a quick bit about Odyssey. We are an interfaith media nonprofit which drives social change through innovative storytelling and media, connecting faith and secular communities. We are the producers of the film series Healing the Healers, which provides faith leaders and educators with conversations just like this one today, sharing intimate conversations between colleagues about how it really is in the midst of the most challenging spiritual care and justice crises. In our past town halls, we have found some aspects of beloved community together via the use of Zoom's chat feature. So feel free to type hello from your geographical or your vocational context. And also to find out a bit about who's in the room right now, we're just going to post 2 poll questions. These are anonymous and optional, but we've also heard appreciation from our networks for our curating of resources that are mentioned by our panelists and partners. So if in the midst of this event you fear you can't keep up with all the titles or websites mentioned, have no fear. We will capture and curate all of them in the expert resource guide that will be created following this event. And one resource we'd like to highlight, just released this month, is the Doing Theology in Pandemics project, a partnership with Chicago Theological Seminary, in which 12 leading theologians and religion scholars present public lectures on how to make meaning, care for others, and cope in a time of massive communal trauma. So, given the weight and the urgency of our topic today, I really need to say what a sincere honor it is to have this conversation with these colleagues here who are in regions, leading communities, providing care in the midst of intense pain and division related to the upcoming election and compounded by pandemic-related crises. The Odyssey team has spent many hours having conversations with faith leaders and chaplains on this topic. And over the last month or so, we have heard over and over again 2 things. One, this topic is so important. Please do engage this topic of election extremism. And then from the very same people, I am sick unto death of this topic sometimes. It is exhausting. So the point is that we're keenly aware of exhaustion levels. And to that end, we want to emphasize that healing for all is our goal in today's conversation. So with that, panelists, would you please just briefly say hello and introduce yourselves?
I'm Jan Fuller, the University Chaplain at Elon University, coming to you from North Carolina.
And I'm Matthew GEWIRTZ. I'm the Senior Rabbi of Congregation B'nai Jeshurun in Short Hills, New Jersey. Also really happy to be here.
Hi, I'm DANJUMA Gibson. I teach pastoral care, pastoral theology at Calvin Theological Seminary in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Hello, Gabriel or Gabe Salguero, President and founder of the National Latino Evangelical Coalition and pastor of the Gathering Place in Orlando, Florida.
So right now, we'd just love to dig in and ask each of you, based on your context, your life experience, just getting a sense of when it comes to this topic, what is top of mind for you? So the first one is to Gabe. Gabe, you know, these issues of painful division within the faith community have long been front and center for you, and you are in 3 communities that are experiencing a great deal of focus: Florida, evangelical, and Hispanic. So what do expressions like political polarities and election extremism mean to you these days?
I think that what I hear most is, how do we balance truth and civility? How do we balance conviction and civility? That people want to speak into the public sphere, into the electoral space, but at the same time, they don't want to demonize or injure people with whom they deeply disagree. And so I think that what people are looking for is moral and spiritual leadership, to use the language of my tradition, that balances the prophetic and the pastoral. And they have seen so many examples of it being done wrong that they're looking for healthy moral exemplars, to quote Dr. Peter Paris, to speak into that place. And so I think really people don't want to be absent. They don't want to, I don't think people want to run away from the public discourse. I just think they want a different tonality and a different way of moral and spiritual leadership. And it's in high demand and low supply.
At high demand, low supply, indeed. And to DANJUMA, you're teaching pastoral care in Michigan, a place where recent events have exhibited for the nation the frightening potential for violence that haunts conversations around political polarity right now. So what are you seeing and thinking these days?
Thank you for that question. What comes immediately to mind is that what we're seeing today is not new. We've been here before. There's a philosopher by the name of George Santayana, and he comes with this classic quote, "Those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So when we think of all of the public tension and the various discourses and this threat of violence, we just celebrated in death John Lewis, C.T. Vivian. We like to celebrate people like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, but they have actually given us an example of how we can have this public discourse. It was a painful example, but they've given this example. And in each of those, if we could just sum all of it up, their expression was about, we are all citizens. And what does it mean to be a citizen and to be treated like a human being? What does it mean to be an American? There was only one thing. It wasn't culture. It wasn't your background. It wasn't the tone of your skin. It's an agreement on our founding documents that say we all have inalienable rights to exist, to live. And when violence threatens that, that's not politics. Politics, that's a foundation on which we do our politics, upon which we do that. And so when we think about, for instance, what's happened here in Michigan and this threat of violence, we have to speak out against that. We have those examples. Who did that? That says, now we've crossed a line, and faith leaders have to unequivocally step up at that point and say, you've gone too far. That's not politics. That's violating our standards of what it means to be human and what it means to be an American. And when we don't do that, and we get into the practice of that, sometimes I'll share with my students, we're familiar with this parable of the Good Samaritan, where the priest passed by and the Levite passed by this injured person. And I'll tell them, you know what, that was practice. They practiced doing that. That became muscle memory to ignore those who are being violated. When that happens, now it's dangerous because we run the risk of undermining our capacity to be moral agents. And that's one of my biggest concerns. We've seen this before. We celebrate these examples. We commercialize their names. But at the same time, we negate the values that they stood for, mainly which every life is valuable. Everybody is important. And it's upon that that we do our politics.
Thank you. Well said. And Janet, chaplains often have more skills and experience in leading and providing care in all kinds of diverse and secular contexts. So you, as a university chaplain with a mandate to care for all faiths, what are you seeing and hearing on campus, and what are the challenges you might be facing with counseling youth right now? You're on mute.
Thank you. Story of my life this year.
Yeah, it's real.
I will say that we are an intentionally multi-faith community. So we have students who are from every faith and tradition, and none of them. And in increasing numbers of our students don't identify with one tradition, or they might identify with several. They're fluid in many ways. Religiously and spiritually, they're fluid. They are not going to, they're post-denominational. They really don't care what they're called. They don't identify by the main line or by those words that we use. And so they're teaching us to think more broadly. They're teaching me to think more broadly about how we identify ourselves and how we claim positionality in several communities at once, and how we blend our allegiances. So we're learning about multiple belonging, and about hypocrisy, and from the young people. We were unprepared for the election in 2016, and on the morning when the results were clear, a senior colleague of mine advised that the chaplains do nothing, say nothing, don't take a stand, because we know you're all social activists over there. You're social justice activists. And it was stunning to me that social justice activism had suddenly put me in a dangerous position politically, and that my staff and I were now being considered on one side of the divide because of the stands for justice that we were about. This year, we're trying to be a little bit more prepared, and trying to think about how to address that. A few weeks ago on our campus, a convoy of Trump trucks, about 150 of them, a parade, came through with flags and Confederate flags that are very popular down here in North Carolina, and signs that were making fun of the Black Lives movement. It was Rosh Hashanah in the afternoon, and this parade came through campus. Our Jewish students were on their way to their Tashlik service, the final service of Rosh Hashanah, of their observance. Many of our Black students, because it was a Saturday, were out and about, and so this came through the main thoroughfare. Our queer students were traumatized by this, and it was clear to me again that that now projects toward justice are considered leftist somehow. I don't know how that happened. I don't know when that happened, but it is clear that, and the Trump parade that came through really got, it was a rally, but it got conflated with hate speech, and we have been working with our students since then to address the trauma that imposed. Just the sight of that going by indicated accumulated distress over all of these months, years, maybe decades, I don't know. And then a few weeks after that, several of our students who had been very upset, I mean, we have lots of them, but they'd been talking about it, and they led a march around the main streets on our campus to claim our streets back, to take our streets back. So in contest to that, the hate parade, they posed a unity parade, a parade that really a march to claim this is our space and this is our home. It's not just any public street, it's the home of young people. It's the home of our residential students. So we are seeing lots of pain and lots of distress, and a lot of I appreciated what you said, Gabe, because a lot of our students, I think, have not been educated to have these civil discourses. We're working on that, we're trying that, but when conversations go underground, and people's identities are underground, and we're no longer being authentic about who we are and what our concerns are, and when we have to guard our sense of looking and striving for justice, then we are in trouble.
And actually, it's a great segue. So, and Matthew, you've shared with us that you've said to your congregation, you know what, we don't sit on the right aisle or the left aisle, we sit on a Jewish aisle. Tell us more about these issues of political polarity, how they seem to you right now from where you sit.
Thank you. I loved hearing all three of my colleagues answer these questions, and I'd love to go back to that transition to when we suddenly became leftists by virtue of our position, because I think that's a complicated and important question. So yes, we've seen this before, but I think this current generation has an experience, this iteration of division, and I would say I'll start off with the pessimistic point of view that our fabric is being ripped apart. I feel like any and every place I go, at a diner, in my congregation, in a class, walking down the street, I actually feel like the fabric is ripping right in front of us. So that's the pessimistic. I'll go optimistic eventually. I'm a rabbi after all. But so the Jewish aisle, by the way, was just in my sermon to a Jewish audience. That can mean a Christian aisle, it can mean a Muslim aisle, it could be a Buddhist aisle. And what I meant by that is that it's time for us to be meticulous about removing politics and filling it in with ethical imperative. And to use that muscle memory, as one of you said, to say that there are certain things we believe in by way of our religion. I'm going to take an easy one, I hope. And let's take hunger. We should all, pretty much sitting in churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, believe that people shouldn't be hungry. And we can prove that point. We could biblically use proof text, and then it's up to us to go out there and manifest that through any political aisle we want to, as long as we agree that people shouldn't be hungry. And that's different than people getting up and saying, my candidate is the way to go, or even alluding to the fact that my candidate is the way to go. And I think that construct, although explained just simply now for time purposes, can be used and applied in many different ways. I was woken up, even though, when you're living in real time and life is fluid, you don't always realize what you're living through until you're able to look back a little bit. And for me, looking back, it was obviously everything changed in 2016. We were all surprised, across the spectrum. I guess it was January, February, where the president decided to put into effect what I actually was too naive to believe that he would, which was the Muslim ban. I guess you really should listen to people when they say things. So my wife and I, with the 3 kids, are driving back to my father-in-law's, and we both looked at each other, we got to go to the airport. So we go to Newark Airport and we protest, and we put something online, and within hours, from people outside of the congregation, I was told that I am Osama bin Laden raising children and all the kinds of radical terrorist contexts. But that you sort of expect in social media. But then I got sort of just a rush of phone calls and letters, some of them cowardly because they were anonymous, most of them not. And I spent something like 50 hours returning every single phone call that week. And my president at the end of the week said, was that really worth your time? And I said, 100%, let me tell you why. When I got on the phone, generally it'd say, hello, Rabbi, with this real anger in the voice. And I would say, hello, so-and-so, how you doing today? Is everything okay? Are you and so-and-so and the kids okay? Oh, yes, Rabbi, thank God we're all okay. How's your family? So boom, right away, lower the temperature. And then they would get into it and say, I'm really nervous that you are, left and all you is a mouthpiece of the Democratic Party. And then I would go further into conversation, and I would hear things like from one person, I'm an immigrant and I spent time 6 months in a holding camp. And I want to tell you what that experience did for me and how I think about today's immigration debate. Another guy said, my dad was one of the first people shot by a terrorist. He was in Taba, Egypt. And a fundamentalist group broke in and shot his father dead with 3 other people. Let me tell you what it feels like to have a father killed by terrorists and how that frames my experience and how I look at these debates. So that experience framed them on the other side of where I was, but they were coming from a really, really heartfelt, sincere, authentic, vulnerable place that made them perhaps more fearful of the world than I might be in certain respects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the conversations all ended with them saying to me, I want to teach and raise my kids differently the way that I feel right now, but only if you help me work through this. And what I fear is that when you do things like go to the airport and it looks like you are being a piece or a mouthpiece of the Democratic Party, basically you're not going to be there to hear me, pastor to me, and care about me in the ways that I have fears of the world. And that just opened up a huge lesson when someone actually thought that I would not tend to them because their political beliefs were different than mine were. And that really opened up a whole new world, a new way of thinking to me.
Yep. I think all four of you have already opened up so many of the, you've represented so many of the topics that have come in through registrants in advance. There's already just tons of good kernels here for rich further conversation. One sort of topic under which we've received questions and comments is around private versus pulpit. Pamela in Massachusetts says, are there any conditions under which simply refraining from a conversation is the wise thing to do, and what specific conditions? And then Patricia from Minnesota says, how are we inviting people to deeper dialogue, not and away from being nice and not talking, as well as stating stands and agreeing not to talk? So you can hear in there just a lot of desire to figure out what it means to navigate this space between public and private, and when silence is healing and when it's harmful. Actually, and I'm wondering, in our conversations with both Gabe and Matthew, this came up a bunch. Would either of you like to take just talking about what's at stake for pastors and how it is that you make the complicated decision about when to talk about something and when not to?
Look, I think that is a great question that rabbis, priests, pastors, imams, chaplains, leaders in every religious space and leaders in public are asking, but not just the leaders, the people in the pew and in the aisles. Look, I think that every person has to count the cost, right? And what they're willing to do, because courage is a virtue, but it's not easy. But so is wisdom and being circumspect. And so for me, again, I'm not establishing this as a norm. For me, I never enter into these delicate matters in the social media space. I think it's too impersonal. I think it's not a real conversation. I think it fosters people talking past each other. And so the direct conversation, I do not think that the political differences and cultural differences, I do not think social media is the healthiest space or the wisest space to do that. I do think there are platforms where you create, in a church where I went to seminary right across the street, there was a midweek service called Space for Grace. All right. And when I used to go to that service, it's not what you think. It's Space for Grace, where people are free to speak truth in love. And so it wasn't, people had to shy away from their deepest held convictions. And so what I tell people is, yeah, we have to make a commitment to truth and to deep convictions, right? Civility is not the absence of conviction. And that's where the balance is, right? Because people say, if I say something about justice, I'm not being uncivil. I'm speaking my deepest conviction. And sometimes cowardice masks itself as wisdom. And so that's the balance, right? In all of the wisdom traditions, it's how you balance courage and truth and civility. And so the congregation that I pastor, I'm quite sure I have people from every side of the political spectrum, right? I'm Hispanic, overwhelmingly Democrats, and I'm evangelical, overwhelming Republican. So they all live in that space. And what I've told people is, you have to speak your deepest conviction in a way that doesn't demonize the other. In my own family, we have that difference, right? In my siblings, in my parents, in my in-laws, all of that is true. And so what I would tell people is, if you're gonna have the conversation, here are a few things. Number one, never have a conversation that requires you to obfuscate you. Your true self needs to come through. Your deepest convictions and your true self, as Henry Nouwen and others would say. Number two, never have a conversation that makes you obfuscate the other and dehumanize the other. And number three, never have a conversation that makes you obfuscate truth and justice. And so if you look at those three things, you can speak truth and justice. you can not hide your true self, and you cannot demonize the other. Those three have been driving principles in my public conversation and in my private conversation.
Hey, the rest of you like to chime in on that one? Yeah.
Sure. I think that people are flocking away from institutional religion. Jan alluded to what millennials are thinking on campus. And so there's a lot of reasons for that, and that's for a different conversation. But I do think that we might be one of the last spaces available in the nation to be a convening space for uncomfortable conversations. Everyone talks about the need for the uncomfortable conversations. I actually see very few of them happening. And as I like to joke around, it's certainly no longer possible at the Thanksgiving table. No one wants to go home anymore for holidays because of that fear. So we have the opportunity to be relevant in ways that I think synagogues, churches, mosques, temples have not been perhaps in decades. Now the question is, what are we going to do with that opportunity and that privilege? This goes back to the, I think, implicit complicity that we have played in why people think we have taken a political position. Because I think that even clergy have slowly but surely, out of complete anger, frustration, and what's going on in the country, and I feel a lot of it myself, but we've drifted into the positions that have been clothed in our biblical proof texts, but actually have ended up becoming positions themselves, partisan positions themselves, without necessarily making room for others who think differently than we do and don't have the equipment of the biblical proof text to weigh into that dialogue. So I agree that we have to be completely relevant and we have to be the convener of those conversations. But I myself have had to look into the mirror really carefully to make sure that I'm not sneaking in a little bit of what I care about by way of my politics as I'm speaking in the name of religion. I publicly left my political party. It probably won't be pretty obvious for you all to know what that is. But I did in the name of religious, sort of becoming the religious Switzerland, so that I am really there to fight for justice and ethics and morals, and in my case, Jewish faith, but all faiths, and not in the name of the Democratic Party. And that really bought me a lot of capital with people to say, wow, he's actually going to change his affiliation just to make sure that the conversation is as important as his partisan positions are.
Can I add something there, Katie? And so I'm very appreciative of the wisdom from my colleagues that have spoken into this question about, social media, your own personal agenda. There's a lot of wisdom there. But when I think of your question, rhetorically, I ask myself, man, what a privilege it is to choose if you will have a conversation or not. It's an incredible privilege to be able to say, I won't talk about this anymore and live life as normal. And so sometimes I ask myself, what is the cost of not having the conversation? What is the cost of this not being addressed or preached? So for instance, and I come to this, from a scholarship perspective. When we think of some of the classical writers, Gustavo Gutierrez, James Cone, Martin Luther King, there was a voluminous amount that he wrote, various feminist scholars, womanist scholars. Sometimes I will suggest it's not because they had a preference or it was necessarily, this is what I like. They wrote because it was a life and death situation. In James Cone's first book, this is happening in 1968 on the other side of the assassination of Martin Luther King. Gustavo Gutierrez was writing because of the community. And so I think, as I think about this and reflect on it, I ask the question, what is the cost if you don't speak? What is the cost of posterity and our children and successive generations? And so who has the privilege to have a conversation? cut it off. And then who has to speak? When we think of those in the civil rights era, their God talk and their prophetic talk, that's all they had. The moral persuasion was all they had. They didn't have the connections. They didn't have necessarily the money. It was to move the conscience of a society to live up to those principles of treating all people with a sense of dignity. And so I think that's important to keep in mind also. What's the opportunity cost, or what's the invisible cost of not having the conversation?
So one of
Dan, you want to comment? Yeah.
One of the things I'm thinking is that we're talking, I do know that preaching in this moment is one of the hardest things to do. But I'm also thinking that preaching is a one-sided tool. And we're speaking, and this is what social media is too. We're speaking and not listening. And I think the discipline of, now, university chaplains, I do very little preaching. Well, that's probably very good. What I do more of is listening. So, and Tilly Edwards, the poet, and I think theologian, says that we listen each other into existence. Well, so what's the forum for, I'm gonna have a sermon and I'm gonna tell you what I think the roots of our spiritual tradition offer us in regard to fear, or in regard to how we make the decisions that we make, not in party lines and not in individual issues, but what does our spirituality teach us about how we make difficult decisions and how we weigh the costs? And then where is the space to listen and to have a real conversation? It's certainly not in worship. It's certainly not in our preaching, is not that. So then where do we have those spaces where we say, okay, now let's talk together? I also think the problem with American Christianity, at least, is that it's become so individualistic. It's not about the community anymore. It's about me and my needs and my position and what I want to say. And where are the spaces where we say it's not about me, it's about us? And where is the us, and when does the us come together to figure out who we are? I don't have the answer to that question, but I think that's one of the great heresies of American Christianity, that we've made this all about one individual at a time, and lost the sense of how are we together? What does it mean for us to be together and to live together and to have those, and to be in conversation with each other? That's a skill, especially in the pandemic moment, that we've lost. And so our young people don't have models for that. What they have models of is potshotting and soundbiting, and they don't have models of sustained dialogue, sustained conversation, and learning to listen to things that are painful. I think of that as a white person, that I'm learning to listen, and it's a long journey, but I'm learning to listen to Black voices who say to me, your privilege is based on our oppression, and I'm learning to hear that, and to find my place in that. That is my place. And it's not easy to hear, but our young people need models for that. Our old people do too.
Yep. And I think this all leads us to another big node. And so one other place where we've, just in terms of answering that question, what's next, and how can, to Rabbi's point, how can the faith space be this space that doesn't exist as much in the civic sphere, to relate to so many things of what you said. So we have a question from Madeline in New York. No matter who is pronounced the winner of this national election, it is frightening to think of the consequences. More division, more violence. And then from Alan in New Jersey, how do you respond to Trump supporters who will not accept the results of the election if Trump loses? This was a conversation, and things even from the time we started 30 days ago working on preparing this for this event. As we know, things shifted about, much happened. And so the question is, so it will be so important, right, for all kinds of leaders to be bringing their best to this moment. But what's unique about what faith leaders can bring and can be, no matter how things go in the next 30 days? I'll open that up to any of you.
You know, so I started off pessimistically, so I have to give some optimism. I believe in my heart of hearts that despite the fabric ripping apart, that people themselves ultimately have a yearning to find good, be fulfilled, live a life that's worthy of whatever meaning means to them. And I think the unique place that we have is reaching that place, that there's this, I really do believe that there's this light that's put into us when we come into this world, and there's all this, what I call soul brush that gets in the way. And our jobs as clerical leaders is not to clear it for them, but to help give people the tools to clear that brush, to find their light, and to feel fulfilled in that light, to feel grateful that they're alive. And because of that gratitude, because of that fulfillment of what their life's purpose, of that light, if you will, is they're automatically going to want to connect that to other people's light. And they realize, by the way, that as good as they think it feels to live in a world of dissing others and putting other people down, that ultimately they feel 100 times more, exponentially more fulfilled when their light connects to other light to shine upon a community. And I think that's our unique place. That's different than politics altogether. That's not a policy position, that's a position of humanity.
I think that if you're asking about the unique role, I don't know if it's unique or it's a voice in the chorus of roles that need to be played. Look, I'm quoting from the Hebrew prophet Zephaniah. He's talking in an exilic moment, and he says, "We are prisoners of hope." Now, the challenge with hope is that it gets translated in the public sphere as a Pollyanna, do-nothing utopic illusion. But and now I speak as a Christian, but I think in most faith traditions, hope is a calling. It's an ethical imperative to work towards justice. If you have hope, you work towards justice, which is, as Cornel West says, what love looks like in public, quoting Dr. King and others, actually. And so the reality is that because we are prisoners of hope, we are called to work towards justice. The arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. It was not a Pollyanna declaration. It was a calling. Because the moral universe bends towards justice, we work towards justice. And so I think that one of the things we speak about is no matter who wins, on the Wednesday after that, the work of justice continues. Your candidate wins, you have to hold him accountable. Your candidate loses, you have to hold the other candidate accountable in truth and justice. And here's the work of hope and justice, which is interstitial, is often tied to the common good. Now, I may say something that is going to resonate with some and not with others, but this is a conversation, so we learn. If we're calling people towards the work of justice, to shalom, to salam, to paz, right? Justice is that road to that, not the absence of conflict. Justice is the road to peace, to salam, to shalom, paz. The reality is that there's going to be resistance. Tocqueville had this thing about democracy, the great experiment of democracy in America, a more perfect union, all of that language. That's work. That's work. And here's the thing that I often get things. If we believe in that we're working for the common good, we have to make moral judgments. Moral judgments have to be made. When things are wrong, and this is a problem of late modernity and postmodernity as a faith leader. And we do it all the time. Anti-Semitism is wrong. That's a moral judgment. Racism is wrong. That's a moral judgment. Misogyny is wrong. That's a moral judgment. And I could go on, right? Sexism, classism, hypermilitarism, I could go on, right? Scripture and our sacred text, whatever, it makes moral judgments all the time. So how do we balance making moral judgments that contribute to justice and hope while respecting the other? That's what we have not taught. And most of my church are millennials and Gen Zs. That's that cha-cha-cha, that cumbia, that salsa, that merengue, that waltz. We have not taught people that moral judgments are necessary for the common good while respecting individual opinion. Who has taught us to navigate that in the public sphere where demonizing the other is a challenge? But you know what also is a challenge? You shouldn't demonize the other, but you should also not let the other get away with injustice. And that is, I don't master it. I get called on it all the time. I've made mistakes. But I think that our fear of making moral judgments that contribute to justice and the common good has silenced many toward this false virtue of centrism. Centrism is not an ethical virtue.
If I could just ask a question to that, is I agree with moral judgments, racism, misogyny, all of it. But since we are complicated creatures and some people have racial bias that can be helped before it becomes racism, and don't know Jewish people, so they may say anti-Semitic things because they come from a place where they never met a Jew before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we are too pontificating in our moral judgments and don't open the space to help people who may just be, and I say the following, not in judgment, ignorant because of where or how they've grown up, I think we are in danger of pushing them completely to the side of actual racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, et cetera. And I do think that there's something about our role to try to know when to pivot, when to salsa, when to merengue, to make sure that we don't push the wrong people away who could actually become allies. So it's a question statement.
Yeah.
And I want to interject. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Gabe.
Rabbi, you're spot on, right? Because it's not just what you do, but how you do it. And there's nuance there, right? That's why I call it a dance, right? Yeah. I'm not a good dancer. My wife is an exquisite dancer.
I'm with you.
Yeah. I have two left feet. I mean, it's not, and you know, my wife is like, are you sure you're Puerto Rican? Like it gets intense. But yeah, because she's, you know, the rhythm is going to get you. Gloria Estefan says, well, the rhythm got me. And so I think that when we say we make moral judgments, part of that moral judgment is talking about root causes and ignorance versus intent versus maliciousness versus will. I mean, it's a complicated, right? That's why social media platforms are not ideal for it, because we lose the nuance, we lose the dance. Social media is not a dance. Social media is as Dr. Jan said, it's a blunt instrument. We're not Shema Yisrael. We're not listening to each other. There's no empathy. It's just a platform for us to say what we want to say with very little listening. So I agree with you 100% that there's nuance and there's caveat, and that's why I started with the balance of conviction and civility. And so I have to own, right? That moral judgment starts with me. I have to own my prejudices and my biases and my ignorance before I speak about the communal one, that it starts with my brokenness.
If I could add to that really quickly, I think on this conversation, we also have to be careful of this dualism that says, I cannot love my community or I cannot love this country and at the same time decry injustice. This is something, again, we're not the first generation to deal with this. We have, you know, in the ancestors and those who've gone, you know, across faith traditions, and they were often accused that if you decry the injustice, that is evidence that you are somehow unpatriotic or that you somehow don't love the community, you don't love me, you don't love. And so I think we also have to do work to debunk that sort of dualist thinking. And then just quickly to address your question of what can faith leaders bring? I love the conversation that's had. I think also it is helping communities to mourn and to grieve. There's a lot of grief work that has to happen after this year, where you have this intersection of social unrest, of a pandemic. There are a lot of illusions that have been disturbed, illusions of safety, illusions of innocence, illusions that we're fine and there's nothing to fix. Part of the work, I believe, of faith leaders is to compel a community, to coach a community, to grieve. And on the other side of grieving is a capacity to love in a deeper way. And if we forget this process of grieving, I think this is what we see in Job. I think the whole book, in my view, as a pastoral theologian, is one of grief work because of the incredible losses that he incurred. But in that last chapter, I don't think this was about God giving him something back. I think this is about, after his grief work, after his lament, after him having to deal with his own interior demons, his own vices, then he's saying, okay, I'm going to give love another try. And I fear that churches and communities, after all that we've been through, injustice, structural racism, people are hesitant to give hope and love another try. And so I think Gabriel was speaking to this. I think Donald Capps talks about this. He says, we are agents of hope. We have to be. And part of that is compelling communities, and we don't like to do it, to do appropriate grief work, because the risk is we will have a truncated, deformed understanding of love on the other side of this. The worst being, I've given up on it because it doesn't work.
To add to that, I think one of the privileges of being spiritual leaders and being and the training that we get is in seeing the long view and the long both history and future of our traditions. So it's not that we have the answers, it's that we see things in a larger perspective sometimes, if we can remember to do that. And we have the possibility of helping others to see beyond this moment. So that's what I'm trying to do on campus as we see ourselves in this little fragile bubble in a pandemic, trying not to infect anybody else. Can we see beyond this one moment that we're in? The other day I sat with a student whose mother died 3 months ago. And I'm really connecting with what you said, Dr. Gibson, because we as Americans don't know how to grieve. Like, we think it should be over in 3 days. And if it's not over in 3 days, then something's wrong with you. And so, normalizing grief, even trauma, acknowledging that this exists and that we are living in this both emotional and spiritual turmoil. Sometimes I think it's the chaplain's job, and it may be the pastoral leader, the clergy's job, to name the pain, because so much of the culture that we live in doesn't want to talk about pain. We don't want to talk about sin. We don't want to talk about brokenness. We want to all be perfect and curated, and we want, I don't want you to see my messy desk behind me. So, we want to look perfect. It is part of an American racist society too, right? But it's part of the culture that we live in. And if we're afraid of the broken places, and if we're afraid of the painful places, then where are we? So I do think that we have to learn to connect with the longer view. That's where I think the hope is, though I myself admit as a human being that I have days when I cannot see beyond the pain of this moment. and I struggle myself to figure out what hope looks like in a moment like this. But I do think that's where our leadership has to be, wherever we are.
Yep. So I want to interrupt this. This is so good with another question from the chat, and our time is getting limited. So here's the question, and then what I want you to do is just think about from your context, not about like how, answer the question with a brief, like give us a picture of how this would really play out in your space, like an example. Okay. So the question is from Robert. Two sides of an argument are not necessarily equal. How do we firmly present a moral point of view, ground in our identity as faith leaders? Well, he says, do we firmly present a moral point of view without dishonoring those on the other side? So just think about, like, from your context, if it's, you know, Jan, for you, working with a student after the election where you have an opening for a conversation, and it's a hard one, what might it look like? For the rest of you, you know, and Gabe, for you, however the election goes, yeah, brief snapshot. Just give us a, like, okay, here's how I could imagine, here's an example for how this could happen.
So I'm willing to say that I still think we have to listen.
Of course, yes.
I'm going to have a conversation with the young man who is the president of the College of Republicans. In any case, I'm in conversation with him. He's a person of deep faith and conviction, and I want to say to him, I'd like to listen to what you have to say. I also have something I want to say. So let's listen. Let's listen to each. I know that's not the solution, but that's what I know how to do.
Yeah, no, that's a great, yeah. So quickly, that's a yes.
I would quickly add, you know, in education, sometimes there's this notion of a classroom being a safe space. We have to reassess that. I have to give up my desire to feel good after I listen to you and after we have every conversation. And this hermeneutic, this tool of hermeneutics that says it's right if I feel good or if you make me feel good, and if it's no conflict at all, we're using the affect of feeling good to determine, really to make moral arguments.
Yeah.
And so safe space has to mean something else than feeling good. If it's about honoring my humanity, again, what I started with, what does it mean to be an American? Protecting our humanity and honoring that. But I can't expect that in all of this, I'm going to feel good and things are going to be just peaches and cream. That's not a prerequisite for walking in solidarity.
And I would add to that, I love what you just said, that uncomfortable has become unsafe, and that's not okay. Unsafe is never okay. Uncomfortable should always be okay. That's A. B is that I'll go back to the person I told you about whose father was killed by a terrorist. I believe that he needed to be held and is still mourning that lost father before he was able to be vulnerable enough to talk about what was actually going on inside. And that means that we need to model vulnerability. Doesn't mean we have to bare our souls to the world inappropriately, but I have come more and more to want to be vulnerable in front of my congregation. I hope as an invitation for them to do the same, which will lead to more civil paths of discourse.
I think that what the fellow panelists have said is very instructive. When I talk to members of my church, when I talk to family members, both older and younger, I say, you have the right to speak, but you also have the responsibility to listen. You have the right to speak, but you have the responsibility to listen. And I mean empathetic listening, right? And I do think that this collapsing of uncomfortable with unsafe is really doing damage to civil and courageous discourse. And so how do I walk with somebody? The picture is this. Hey, this hurts somebody else. this oppresses somebody else, right? Help us develop the capacity to see each other, to really see each other. And I think that is the work of moral and spiritual leadership to some degree.
Thank you. This is so good. Here's some pain. I will speak to a little discomfort I'm feeling in this moment. The discomfort is there's so many good questions we didn't get to, but here's the hope. The hope is that we are actually going to convene a second conversation that's information after the election. We're looking to get beyond the November 17th date. Yeah, so please know that we're collecting all questions and we continue to, and that's these help us shape the next conversation. So now we're going to our last question, which is, where are you finding hope or joy right now? And I love that we've already unpacked a little bit about the richness of the word hope. And also I just want to add the richness of, you know, that healing, and so this is my pastoral theologian parts coming out, that healing doesn't just look like feeling better. It's a collective act. Healing is collective when we all are flourishing more. And so who would like to go first on the just quickly, where you're finding hope or joy right now? Jan.
I'll start because I am very aware that young people are leading us to break the structures that have bound us. They're calling all of the institutional structures into question and making us look at them. And I think they're going to lead us in a way, and I'm looking to them for hope. I see hope in them. They are not universally, they're not a monolith. But they are going to teach us a new way.
I would agree. I look at all of the global protests this summer, and it was not just Black and brown people. It was people from all cultures, white. The millennial generation is teaching us a lesson, and we have to listen. For generations now, for decades, we've said that Sunday morning is the most segregated time in America. I get it, I understand. But for some reason, our children overnight got in the streets and protested Black Lives Matter across cultures. Now you have to imagine they didn't get together before and say, okay, what is your doctrine? What is your doctrine? And do we agree about this or that? What did they show us overnight that a institutional church still has not been able to grasp for generations? So I have a lot of hope in what we're seeing in our young people and in our millennials.
Yeah, I echo that in terms of what they've said about youth in both millennials and Gen Zs. In the immigration space, I've seen Latino walking with HIAS, Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, and people who are against banning refugees from Islamic countries. And so I saw that broad coalition, that mosaic, that beautiful mosaic in the immigration space, the same as we saw around racialized policing, the same we saw around education. Mm-hmm. And so they are both courageous and they are boundary breaking relationships among young people that give me hope. And maybe it's because on PS4, my kid is playing with somebody in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and London, England.
Oh, I'll tell you something. Between us not being able to dance and our kids on PS4, we have a lot to talk about together. I would say that since we have experienced and are experiencing a virus that has inhibited the ability to breathe, that I have found hope in the fact that people have gone back to the base level, that they thank God in the morning that they actually can breathe. And that gratitude, this is scientifically proven, not just proven by what we've known as faith leaders forever, can physiologically and spiritually change your game. That's A. And then with this, the B is unadulterated laughter. Thank God I have not heard people while they're on the streets protesting, in the synagogue, playing outside, that somehow through all of this, we have not stopped unadulterated laughter. And there's a fulfilling joy about gratitude and laughter that I am going to keep on encouraging before, during, and after this election.
Oh, unadulterated gratitude and joy. That is a great place for us to come to a close. Just to remind everyone, this entire event has been recorded and will be available as a free resource on Odyssey's Healing the Healers website in the coming days and weeks. All registrants will receive a link by email when the recording has been prepared. Please feel free to share with your networks. We also curate clips from this event, and we have an expert resource guide that comes with it. Enormous thanks to you four panelists and to all of the faith leaders who aren't on screen today, but who have participated in bringing together this event and have helped us think so carefully about how to think through these conversations. Huge round of thanks to each of you and your dancing or non-dancing selves. And may we continue to find dancing, healing, and joy and gratitude as we move through this, through the days and the weeks to come.